Nick Perisic.
And I'm Chessa Wang. Today is Tuesday, September 10th, 1901. You're watching a C&C News special report.
With recent events in Beijing this week, and the supposed end of the Boxer Rebellion, we are bringing back reports from the 1840s, 60s, and 90s, and updating you with our latest investigative segments.
Tonight we look back at the earliest traces of British imperialism in China, from the First Opium War in the 1830s to the Treaty of Nanking.
Our reporters will take you in the throne room of England's own Queen Victoria, and inside the influential Forbidden City. What C&C News has discovered over the past couple of decades is not only the collapse of a dynasty, but the crumbling of an empire.
We begin tonight with a special report by C&C News that first aired on December of 1860, following the end of the Second Opium War between China and the British Empire. It was this conflict that, along with the First Opium War, set the precedent for Britain's imperialistic endeavors in the decades to come. For more, we send you to Hong Kong, a major center for British affairs, both economically and politically. I'm standing in front of Victoria Harbour, formerly known as Kowloon Bay. It is here that many naval battles were fought between the British and the Chinese over the controversial opium trade. On September 4th, 1839, the first shot rang over the waters behind me, following riots over the death of a Chinese citizen in the hands of British soldiers. How did this violence and chaos all begin? We dive into the archives with our exclusive 1860 interview, following the end of the Second Opium War and the signing of the Beijing Convention.
Towards the end of the 18th century, British imperialists began to look to East Asia for new trading opportunities. China, with its luxurious, silks and teas, seemed to be a profitable destination. However, the Chinese were little interested in European products, and the British were forced to export silver to the nation, until they realized that they would also trade for British Indian opium. The Chinese people became addicted to the drug en masse, a side effect of opium that the British were quick to capitalize on. The Qing Emperor Dao Guang and his assembly saw this as a ploy by the European barbarians, to weaken the dynasty. Confucian scholars of the time saw that opium was crippling society and economy of China. This tension climaxed when the emperor forced opium warehouses in Canton to close, confiscating nearly 5 million pounds of opium. War broke out when drunken British soldiers killed a peasant in Kowloon, and the British won overwhelmingly in the battles that ensued. Now to Divine Young for more on the Opium Wars.
I'm here with Lin Zhou, Viceroy of Longzhou and opponent of the opium trade. So, Governor, after the initial call to battle in 1839, there were several prolonged wars between the British and you guys, which the British dominated. So, how did this conflict play out?
Well, Divine, after the Emperor Duaogong appointed me to be in charge of abolishing the opium trade, the British weren't happy. With permission from London, they met the Qing Navy in Kowloon Bay outside of Canton and delivered a swift justice with their superior technology. It was a harrowing blow to Chinese confidence, but we persevered. The further we pushed our efforts to abolish and outlaw the sale of opium, the more the British pushed back against us. For well over a year, the war consisted solely of Chinese legal blows and British retaliations. That is until 1842, when the British sailed into the Pearl River, and they took the city of Shanghai using modern riflery. It was the first time that the weapons were used in combat, and the British defeated us soundly and swiftly. We were at a loss of what to do.
So that's when the British had you sign the Treaty of Nanking, correct?
Yes, it was in August of 1842 that the British forced us to sign the first of what we call the unequal treaties. It was a harrowing blow to the Chinese economy, in which the British bullied in their unfair terms. They ended the largely peaceful Canton system that had been in place for decades. They were given rights to foreign trade in China and the interior of the country, and they were ceded the city of Hong Kong as a foreign protectorate. As I said, it was a harrowing blow to our economy, one I'm not sure we will ever recover from.
Well, there you have it, Sovereignty. The British abused the Chinese systems for over 2 decades of civil strife and political tension. The struggles escalated, which caused conflict and future rebellion. Your Majesty, thank you for letting us have an audience today.
Of course, Divine, anything for you.
After the First Opium War ended, Great Britain and the British East Indian Company started making significant profits in China thanks to the Treaty of Nanking. So why did you then pursue total free trade and greater economic liberties?
Well, Divine, you see, the British were only trying to establish trade in the Qing dynasty in a peaceful way, and during the Arrow War, which we civilized people call the Opium War, the Chinese sunk our vessel, the Arrow, in our ceded waters, which we considered a violation of the Nanking Treaty and a declaration of war.
Okay, after 4 years of devastating losses, the Chinese sued for peace. With the help of the French and the Americas, you were able to take the city of Beijing and force the Qing at the Convention of Beijing to sign a long list of treaties. So what was accomplished by this?
The treaties only brought China up to Western standards, you see. We evangelized all of the Confucians that we could because we set China up to the standards of free religion, and we set aside many colonies on the coast. We also gained full access to Chinese trade, and we legalized the opium trade. For the debts of war that China owed us, they owe us 8 million steels of silver each year for the next 40 years.
The Chinese Viceroy Governor Lin Zhou wrote a letter in 1839 that said to end the opium trade. In it he stated, I quote, that it was poisoning Chinese society. He could see the civilization his people had built over 2,000 years crumble. Did you read this letter?
Lin Zhou? Are you kidding me? I would never read anything that idiot sent me. He burned my ships and sunk my warehouses and destroyed everything.
There are some who have accused your government and the British East Indian Company of purposely dismantling the Qing dynasty for your own profit. What do you say to that?
Well, Divine, the Qing dynasty is still functional in China. I mean, they still can, continue on. We just simply wanted what any multinational imperialist nation would want in terms of trade. What happens over the next 40 years in China is completely out of our control.
Thank you, Your Majesty. Now back to Sarvani Sanka.
Thanks, Chessa. With the institution of the so-called Canton system in 1757, Canton became the only port where legal international trade could be conducted out of China. The Kohong, or regulators of the port system, were granted monopolies by the government, but this had little impact on the British, who were no strangers to trade monarchies themselves. The real root of the problem, and eventual spark to conflict, lay in the age-old trade imbalance between the British and Chinese. The British were importing large amounts of Chinese goods, especially tea, and were exporting equally large amounts of silver to make up for the difference in worth between their goods and China's. The British found a solution to this ever-growing problem on their Indian plantations, opium. The British profited immensely from their monopoly on opium, an incredibly potent drug that a great majority of the Chinese population were addicted to. Demand for opium grew so high that the flow of silver in the world market completely reversed.
That was an exclusive 1860s report on the Opium Wars by Divine Young and Sarvani Sanka. Thank you. We now continue our coverage on British imperialism in China with a report taking place in between the two Opium Wars on the British Protectorate of Hong Kong, a glaring symbol of European greed and power in East Asia.
For a different perspective on what was happening during that time, we turn to our interview with the first and former governor of Hong Kong, Henry Pottinger.
Henry Pottinger negotiated the Treaty of Nanking, which ended the First Opium War, and gave Hong Kong to Britain. He was the first governor of Hong Kong as well, from 1841 to 1843. Here's Annika Rose with the interview shortly following Pottinger's appointment in 1842.
You were the first British governor of Hong Kong. Since becoming governor, you've made a lot of great changes to Hong Kong's government.
I was first assigned as superintendent of British trade in China in 1841. My main task was to establish a treaty that would help us have favorable trade with China. Of course, this was during the Opium War.
That must have been difficult.
We had to prove ourselves capable of crushing the rebellion, so I called upon the British Army, and in about a year or so, under the leadership of Admiral Sir Williams Parker, General Hugo, and myself, we were able to conquer several cities.
Which cities?
Amoy, Shushan, Shintu, and Ningpo.
I see.
In 1842, we were planning on taking the city of Nanking. However, we thought that we had fought long enough, so we decided to sign a peace treaty.
And the outcome of that treaty was that British were given Hong Kong and you yourself established as governor.
And that was not all. China had to pay $21 million for all the opium that they had seized. along with several other cities that we conquered, plus some before the treaty, such as Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo, and Shanghai. They were brought under our control for the trade and the opium trade flourished, so we got the win side of the deal.
That sounds really impressive. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us, Governor.
Thank you.
Now back to the desk.
That was some wonderful insight from our 1842 interview. However, let's steer in the direction of bipartisan thinking. Next, we have our very own Emily Miller, who will talk more in detail of this game-changing treaty.
Thank you, Chessa. Today is September the 10th, and I am currently outside of the British Supreme Embassy in Nanking, the building that originally hosted the Nanking Treaty signing almost 60 years ago in the August of 1842. The Nanking Treaty is a peace treaty that was signed by Britain and China after the First Opium Wars. Let's go inside and take a look at what was actually happening. Now, the treaty gave Britain control over 4 port cities, including Canton. In Article 2, it states, His Majesty the Emperor of China agrees that British subjects, with their families and establishments, shall be allowed to reside for the purpose of carrying on their commercial pursuits without molestation or restraint at the cities and towns of Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo, and Shanghai. And Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain will appoint superintendents or consular officers to reside at each of the above-named cities or towns, to be the medium of communication between Chinese authorities and said merchants, and to see that the just duties and other dues of the Chinese government are hereafter provided for, are duly discharged by Her Britannic Majesty's subjects. Also, in words, we see how the British indebted the Chinese with upfront and future payments in Article 7. It is agreed that the total amount of $21 million described in the 3 preceding articles shall be paid as follows: $6 million immediately, $6 million in 1843, $5 million in 1844. We just saw a little bit of what the treaty entailed for China and Britain. That's all for today. This is Emily Miller at the British Supreme Embassy in Nanking. Back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Emily, for that wonderful insight.
That was indeed insightful, but what happened next? Let's see what the treaty brought upon the Chinese in a short flashback clip of the Taiping Rebellion in 1854, with our very own Ching Se.
Thank you, Chessa. This is Ching Se. For those of you who do not know much about the Taiping Rebellions, we're here today with Hong Xiuquan, the leader of them. So, Hong Xiuquan, what are these freedom rebellions and what would they do?
The rebellion is for freedom!
Well, we kind of already made that clear, but let's start with something else. So the Manchu government has done wonders in these past decades, right?
The tyrants of the Manchu government, they shouldn't be allowed to lead anything. Our reforms will have liberation, will change the whole entire China itself forever.
So the reforms. Now, I've heard that many people think that they're radical, considering that you base them off of Western principles. So how will they play out when they're administered, if they're administered?
I promise the people of China that we will have social reforms within land distribution, and there will be no more rich and greedy people, and also the liberation of women from Confucian ideals.
So that sounds really revolutionary. But I've heard that you guys also have burned a lot of ancestral scripts.
Since these ancestral scripts are only able to be read by the educated people, I've decided to attack these and burn all of them, because this creates a discriminatory barrier for the elite and the normal people. By burning these, I will create a system where everyone is equal.
So you want to make literacy more accessible for everyone, correct?
Yes, and to do all this, we need to destroy all ancient tablets and shrines and adhere our culture, and adhere our cultural falsehood. But however, we're a little low on manpower.
But why not use the Europeans for your manpower?
Currently, the Europeans are fighting their own little battle against the Chinese political government, so they see our issue as too petty.
Yes, I am deeply sad for those lives that have been
really?
lost,
Too
but every
petty?
life
Well,
is offered to us
I've
to help
heard
gain freedom
that
for millions of other
the
lives.
Taiping Rebellions
Can't you
have
see
been
their swift blood
recorded
is one
as
of the
one
many
most
reasons our
destructive
fighters must
military
continue on?
conflicts in
These
all of
lives lost
history.
are what continuously
So,
fuel our anger against the
on another
government.
point, though,
They are the reason that those
from which
lives were lost.
classes
We must
would
fight
you
to
say
repent
that most
what
of your
those
freedom
lives were lost
followers
for.
are from?
Well, since the elite classes see our ideals as contradictory to their Confucianites, and they also see us as our attack on Confucian ideals as crazy or insane. So our ideals would mostly cater toward the lower class, such as the artisans, peasants, farmers, and such.
Demographics has shown that the Taiping rebellions have been so devastating that more than 15 million people have died so far. So, Hong Xiuquan, how do you justify all of these deaths with basically no gain? Well, thank you, Hong Xiuquan, for that wonderful and very helpful insight.
That was our exclusive flashback interview from correspondent Qingse.
Now we go to C&C News' very own Emily Miller with the commoner's perspective on the city.
This is Emily Miller reporting live from the port of Canton with Ping, a local citizen and the stall owner. Sir, can you please tell us what the last few weeks have been like?
Oh, yes, this is my stand. Ever since the Second War, the flow of opium has increased.
Are you a supporter of these changes concerning the products being bought by Europeans?
Ever since the change in power, the amount of money I receive has increased. Though I don't really agree with the usage of opium, I can't really complain that the amount of profits I receive aren't really beneficial to my family ever since the change to British power.
Do you believe there's any reason as to why your stand is gaining so much off of these changes?
Ever since the change to British power, the flow of opium has increased, which this in turn causes the opium prices to decrease, which makes this more accessible to the poor, which makes it easier to sell larger amounts to people.
Does this new flow of goods have a negative influence in your community?
Oh yes, most definitely. There are masses of people that are dying in the streets since the poor have no money, yet the rich are making huge profits through all these changes. Though I myself, for one, count myself as lucky since I have my position as the owner of this stand, but if I lose this job, I would starve on the streets.
Would you agree with the idea that ever since China has lost control over a market that's making so much money, that more Europeans and marketers are benefiting while the general public is struggling?
Go.
Yes, like I said before, people are losing their money to this addictive drug that is opium, and they're losing their control of the market, which is the main source of income for China.
Thank you, sir, for your time and insight. Back to you, Chessa. Thanks, Emily. With the crucial element of Hong Kong tucked under our belts, we've moved to more recent events.
We are all aware that foreign powers have recently crushed the Boxer Rebellion in China. But for more on these events and their impact for the future, we go to Catherine Gan in Beijing.
I'm Catherine Gan, reporting from Beijing, China after the recent aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion. After Western countries forced China into the world economy in 1899, many local peasants started to rebel. This was because Western countries would regulate China's economy according to their own principles, such as exterritoriality, which meant that Western countries did not have to follow Chinese laws, and artificial tariffs, which gave Western products an advantage in the Chinese market. Furthermore, on the local level, many Christian missionaries would exploit their power to win cases and lawsuits for Chinese Christian converts. I'm here today with a Christian missionary, John Williams III. So tell us, John, how effective were your methods at converting the local Chinese to Christians? Did you encounter any resistance in the early 1900s?
Fortunately, we were able to convert several small towns and introduce the religion of Christianity without much resistance. However, when we did start our missionary works in 1899 and the early 1900s, we encountered several incidents of resistance against our missionary groups.
Can you recount exactly when the violence started?
It was a hot blazing day in the early early July of 1900, and I was returning from a trip to the market, and suddenly I heard gunshots. I saw insurgents rushing into town, commanding all the missionaries to line up. I hid in the bushes. I watched as each and every one of the missionaries were executed. It was horrible. The barbarians were definitely out of control. They even killed a governor who was supporting them.
Did you flee the city?
Yes, I fled with several Chinese converts, and we found safety in a nearby village. And after the Boxer Protocol of 1901, I returned to Beijing and continued my missionary work without the fear of being killed.
Thank you. I'm here in Xi'an with Empress Cixi, who helped the Boxers in their fight against Western influence. So tell us about your rise to power and how Western influence thwarted that.
At first, I struggled with the unjust rule plaguing China, and as a result, I had to resort to certain measures to rise to power. I even had to seize power from my son, but he was only 5 years old, so he wouldn't have been able to rule wisely anyways.
Fanboy!
Even after I had struggled through so much, the foreigners that came in and easily seized positions of power was just too much. That's enough. The Boxers were a group dedicated to ridding China of foreigners and those missionaries. My court and I are naturally quite wary of outsiders as well. We like to keep things conservative. Naturally, as someone who was invested in keeping China strong, I issued letters of support to the Boxers and formally declared war on the foreign nations. Here we go. Why were you in Xi'an before the signing of the Boxer Protocol? The Boxers had just been overwhelmed, and there were about 400 troops of foreigners streaming into the city. I was terrified as I watched everything I had built for myself be destroyed. The Boxer Protocol made China weak. Money bled out of China to the foreign nations. Foreign diplomats rose to even higher positions in government. Our own nation was becoming a stranger to ourselves.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
You've just seen two very different sides of the Boxer Rebellion, the supporters and the victims. But what about those caught in the middle? We return to Catherine Gan with a Chinese Christian, here to tell us about the conflict of interest.
I'm here with a local Chinese convert, Xiaoli. So tell us, why did you decide to convert to Christianity?
The summer of 1899 was very tough for us farmers. It didn't rain and the crops didn't grow, so we didn't make a profit. That summer, a group of Christian missionaries came to our village and started preaching about God and how we could trust in Him and believe in Him, and how He would never let us down. I started attending their sermons and soon converted to Christianity because it gave me the strength to push the hard times.
Okay, did you ever experience any unheeded aggression by the Boxers?
Yes, one day when Michael, one of the Christian missionaries, was leading a prayer circle, a group of local peasants came in and burned the local church down. Michael and 100 or so other Christians were killed in the fire, and I barely escaped my life. Those Boxers used violence against those who did no harm to them. I saw so many innocent people killed simply because they chose to convert to Christianity.
Okay, thank you for your time. Luckily, I was able to catch a few quick words with some Boxer rebels who cut off the railroad line at Tianjin. So tell us, what inspired your movement against the Westerners?
Those Westerners also have a privileged position in the Chinese government. They're influencing the court's decisions more and more.
How did your movement change over time?
At first, our movement was geared towards eliminating both the foreigners and the Qing dynasty, but soon afterwards, Empress Cixi started supporting our movement, so we focused more on getting rid of the foreigners instead.
Our movement started out locally due to poor organization. Later, though, we gained more support as more people began to realize how the foreigners were destroying our country. With their support and support from the imperial government, we were finally able to get enough people to get to Beijing and cut the railroad line. Chinese officials began to meet with foreign nations, and as a result, they stopped us from getting weapons and passed reforms to ban us from fighting.
We never lost our fighting spirit, but when the Boxer Protocol was signed, we had to stop our movement because our own men were being punished.
Thank you.
Now we have seen the disastrous effects of what seem to be very harmless visits by so-called barbarians. European prowess, as with previous barbarians, was underestimated, and the results played out for not only decades, but centuries, up until the East's demise. As for China, we can't make any resolute predictions for the future. But we do now know that the British and the West should be dealt with extreme caution. Will the East rise again after this slump, or will they fall to oblivion? We don't know, for there are no more dynastic cycles to depend upon for fortune-telling.
And as we end this section with that one simple question of faith, until next time, this is Chessa Wang.
And I'm Nick Perisic. We hope you enjoyed spending your time with us this evening. Thank you, and good night.